Before we begin, take a slow breath. Let your mind settle and allow this gentle story from the ancient world to guide you into a calm and peaceful night. Tonight, we travel back in time, not with excitement, but with silence. Not to learn quickly, but to listen softly. This is Dreamo History, your calm companion for sleep, relaxation, and peaceful storytelling. The silence that followed the fall of the Titans was not the peace of a golden age, but the stark, echoing void of absolute power. Hera stood at the summit of Mount Olympus, the wind of a new cosmic order whipping the heavy folds of her saffron chiton. Below her, the newly exiled generation, her father, Cronus, and his monstrous kin, were sealed beneath the earth, their screams muted by stone and fear. Above her, the sky, cleared of the old oppressive deities, was an infinite, terrifying blue, now ruled by the one she had chosen, Zeus. She was the eldest daughter, the first to be disgorged from the nightmare of Cronus's belly, yet she was always overshadowed by the audacious, powerful youngest brother who had saved them. He was the thunder, the spectacle, the glorious liberator. She, Hera, was the necessary structure, the silent promise of legitimacy that made his reign not a simple coup, but a dynasty. She was the order to his chaos, the crown that validated the hand that held the scepter. Their courtship was a whirlwind of elemental passion and ruthless pragmatism. The story that would later be told of a rain-drenched cuckoo seeking refuge in her bosom was a soft fable for mortals. The truth was colder, a desperate embrace in a time of war, a binding pact forged in the heat of the Titanomachy. Zeus needed a queen of Titan blood, a royal link to the cosmos they had overthrown, to command the loyalty of the uncertain gods. Hera needed an equal partner to govern the new world, one whose strength matched her own towering ambition for justice and stable rule. "We will build an empire of law," she had sworn to him in the pre-dawn glow of their wedding day, her hand gripping his massive wrist. No more ravenous fathers, no more fear. Our rule will be eternal, just, and sacred. The wedding itself was a spectacle that shook the foundations of existence. Gaia, the earth herself, gifted them the apple tree with its fruit of immortality, a symbol of the fertile eternity of their union. For a time, it was perfect. The young Olympians reveled in their victory, and Hera, crowned Queen of the Heavens, felt the exquisite weight of the diadem settle upon her brow. It was made of gold, but it felt like granite, a burden she accepted with pride. She was no mere consort. She was the goddess of marriage, the very sanctity of the bond between all living things, and Zeus's divine co-ruler. The twin thrones on Olympus were carved in stone, but they were bound by her decree. Hera moved through the new halls of Olympus with a purposeful stride, organizing the council of the gods, establishing their domains, and ensuring the cosmic contracts were held. She was the architect of their new society, a stern, unwavering force of law and tradition. When Poseidon sought to claim the seas, or Demeter the harvest, it was often Hera's steady hand that mediated the balance, lending her ancient wisdom to Zeus's impulsive might. Yet, a subtle, cold truth began to seep into the foundations of her power, like a creeping mist from the world below. Zeus's thunder, once the sound of righteous war, was becoming the beat of a tyrant's heart. The vast, open freedom of the post-Titan world seemed only to awaken in him a restless, consuming desire. The great, soaring eagle of his spirit could not be contained by the gilded cage of a single throne, or a single queen. The whispers started quietly, carried on the breeze from the lower slopes of the mountain. A nymph in Arcadia, a mortal princess in Argos, a disguised visitation in the black of night. Each tale of infidelity was a chip of ice against the glorious burning promise of their marriage. When Hera first confronted him, not in a rage, but with the cool, formal dignity of a queen addressing her king, Zeus merely laughed, a sound like distant thunder rolling away unconcerned. "My lady," he had said, his eyes glittering with a frightening, untamed power. "Do you mistake the nature of a king? The sky is infinite, and so is my dominion. My passion is a force of nature, not a contract to be neatly filed away." That was the moment the true weight of the diadem pressed down, not just as a symbol of power, but as a chain of loneliness. She realized that the purity, the sacred permanence she had built her reign upon, was merely a beautiful construct to him. Her throne was secured by blood and conquest, but her sanctity was subject to his whim. The Queen of Heaven had secured the heavens, but she was losing her king. And in the oppressive silence of Olympus, not one other god, not her siblings, not her children, dared to side with her against the all-powerful cloud-gatherer. Her righteous ambition, once a guiding light, curdled into a bitter necessity. If the king would not uphold the sacred law of the marriage he had sworn to, then the queen would become the law's most terrible enforcer. The love was dying, but the power and the duty to the order she had helped create remained. The burden of that crown, heavier than any physical gold, was now the singular, cold motivation of her reign. This is the second part of your historical narrative. Echoes in the high halls, focusing on the growing discord and the political isolation of Hera on Mount Olympus. The gold of the Olympian palace, so bright in the initial years of the new regime, now felt cold and brittle to Hera. It reflected the brilliance of Zeus's power, but offered no warmth for the queen who sustained its legitimacy. The silence on Mount Olympus had become the most oppressive sound. It was the silence of calculated avoidance, the silent agreement among the younger gods that the king's moods were to be placated, and the queen's growing fury was to be sidestepped. Hera watched her siblings and children at the grand feasts, their eyes flicking away the moment her gaze met theirs. Hestia, her gentle sister, offered only a mute, sad sympathy from her place by the hearth. Poseidon maintained a wary distance, consumed by his watery domain. Even Ares, her belligerent son, dared not defy his father openly, for Zeus's wrath was a quick, obliterating storm. Hera was surrounded by family, yet she was an island, drifting in a sea of deference to her husband. She tried, initially, to reassert her authority through counsel, appealing to the original oath of justice they had sworn. She cornered Zeus in the council chamber, her voice kept low and even, detailing the political instability his adventures were causing. "The mortals lose faith," she argued, sweeping a hand toward the vast map of the burgeoning world. "When the laws of heaven are mocked by their ruler, how can we expect mortals to adhere to the laws of earth? You weaken the very foundation we built." Zeus, leaning back on his throne, was polishing the head of his thunderbolt. He did not look up. "The foundations are solid, my queen. They are made of my power, not your worries. A single indiscretion does not dismantle the cosmos." He finally met her eyes, a spark of pure menace in their depths. And your constant reproaches are a greater disruption than any fleeting liaison. I am the sky. I move where I will. It was then she understood. His infidelity was not merely a personal betrayal. It was a deliberate political act of diminishing her. Every lover he took, every illegitimate child he sired, was a silent declaration that Hera's domain, the sacred bond of marriage and the protection of women, was secondary to his appetite. He was proving that the queen's power was contingent, while his own was absolute and unconstrained. The grand halls of Olympus began to fill with echoes, not of laughter or debate, but of the things left unsaid. When a messenger arrived bearing news of the beautiful Io, turned into a heifer and guarded by the 100-eyed Argus, the other gods exchanged quick, furtive glances. The whole palace knew the truth. Io was Zeus's attempt to hide his mistake from Hera. The truth hung in the air, a physical, sickening pressure. When Hera, in her terrible pride, demanded the heifer as a gift, her voice was perfectly calm. She was not begging. She was forcing him to acknowledge her power, to obey the decorum of their joint rule. Zeus, cornered, could not refuse. The silence that followed his surrender was deafening. It was a victory, but it was a bitter one, proving she could enforce her will only through the exploitation of his lies. Her vengeance on Io, transforming the girl into a tormented creature chased across the world by a stinging gadfly, was not the act of a jealous wife. It was the calculated strike of a political ruler. It was a message etched in fear. This is what happens when you threaten the stability of the crown. This is the cost of defying order. Yet, the silence of the other gods persisted. They saw her cruelty, but they did not see the provocation. They saw the relentless hunter, but not the queen desperately trying to salvage the legitimacy of her throne. The most painful echo was the silence of the future. She looked at the young goddesses. Athena, born fully formed from Zeus's head, and Artemis, the fierce huntress. They paid their due respect, but they were products of Zeus's unilateral power, not her guidance. They represented the new, independent, and often chaotic energy of Olympus, free from the constraints of the sacred contracts that Hera held so dear. Her own children felt distant, pulled away by their father's immense gravity. Hera found herself retreating more and more to the temple dedicated to her on Olympus, a space she had claimed as her own, separate from the shared throne room. It was lined with dark bronze and dedicated to the rites of motherhood and eternal vows. Here, the silence was different. It was the quiet of profound loneliness. She stood before the altar, tracing the lines of her sacred symbols: the pomegranate, the scepter, the peacock. These were her true powers, the ancient ties to fertility, sovereignty, and vision. She realized the battle was unwinnable on Zeus's terms. She could not kill every mistress, nor could she prevent Zeus's will from dominating the cosmos. The high halls were no longer a seat of partnership. They were an arena of her diminishing influence. From this cold, isolated sanctuary, Hera began to conceive a different path. If she could not regain her partnership, she would solidify her independent power. If the gods would not speak out against the king, she would force them to witness his ultimate vulnerability. Her vengeance would cease to be purely reactive. It would become systemic, a long game of destabilization designed to prove that the Queen of Heaven, though silenced and isolated, was still the greatest, most formidable force on Olympus. The diadem felt less like a crown and more like a helmet of war. The echoes in the high halls of Olympus would soon give way to the loud, terrifying spectacle of a queen's righteous rebellion. The lonely sanctuary had served its purpose. Hera emerged from the shadowed bronze of her private temple, not as a grieving wife, but as a military strategist. The days of reacting to Zeus's latest indiscretion with immediate fiery rage were over. Such outbursts were messy, beneath her dignity, and worst of all, ineffective. They merely provided Zeus with evidence of her irrational jealousy, reinforcing the public narrative that she was the shrew and he was the burdened king. Her vengeance would now be an architecture, calculated, layered, and built for the long collapse of her husband's moral authority. Hera understood that she could not attack Zeus directly without plunging the cosmos back into the chaos of a civil war, a risk she would not yet take. Therefore, her targets would be the extensions of his will, his lovers, and more powerfully, the children they produced. These demigods and mortals, products of Zeus's selfish whim, were threats to the Olympian hierarchy, and by targeting them, Hera was seen to be upholding the sanctity of the divine order, masking her personal retribution behind the veil of statecraft. Her most significant project in this new campaign was the young hero, Heracles. The very existence of Heracles, a mortal son conceived under deception, destined for glory, was an insult to the queen of the gods. But Hera saw in him not just an enemy, but a leaver. She did not try to kill him outright. Such an act would make him a martyr, and Zeus a furious avenger. Instead, she used her immense power to manipulate his destiny, twisting his life into a series of impossible, soul-crushing labors. It began subtly. She afflicted him with a temporary madness, forcing him to commit the terrible deed of killing his own family. This single horrific act guaranteed that Heracles could never simply live in peace. He was bound by guilt, forced to seek redemption through the service of his weak, petty cousin, Eurystheus, a man entirely within Hera's manipulation. Hera thus became the silent patron of the 12 labors. Every monstrous beast he fought, every impossible feat he undertook, was a thread in the tapestry she wove. She did not raise the Nemean lion, but she ensured the circumstances of the hunt were cruel and the reward meaningless. She did not summon the Lernaean Hydra, but she ensured the hero had no peace between the slaughters. This strategy was brilliant because it was invisible to the assembly of gods. Hera never publicly declared her intention to destroy Heracles. She simply enforced the cosmic laws he had broken. She was the goddess of destiny and protection. Punishing a man afflicted by divine madness who had committed murder was merely upholding the natural order. Zeus could rage and curse, but he could not intervene without admitting that he had tried to create a rival to the rightful Olympian lineage, thereby undermining his own authority. Hera's influence also extended into the political sphere. She sponsored cities that showed unwavering reverence for her. Argos, her holiest city, was rewarded with prosperity, ensuring that the mortal world maintained a power base loyal to the queen, not just the king. She used her priestesses not just for worship, but as a network of cosmic intelligence, gathering news of Zeus's movements and future plans, allowing her to preempt his next destructive escapade. She became a master of patience. Where Zeus was impulsive, she was deliberate. Where he relied on thunder, she relied on time. She watched the rise and fall of the Trojan War for years, nurturing the resentment of the goddesses slighted by Paris's judgment, slowly building a powerful anti-Zeus coalition. Her greatest moment of calculated defiance came when she orchestrated a brief, silent coup against Zeus himself. Weary of his constant tyrannical threats and his endless parade of lovers, Hera approached Poseidon and Apollo. She laid out her plan with cold, clear logic. Zeus must be temporarily incapacitated, bound by golden chains, to prove his vulnerability and remind him that his power was ultimately contingent on the consent, or at least the fear, of his peers. The moment Zeus was secured, his thunderbolt placed safely out of reach, Hera stood over him, her face a mask of unyielding majesty. "This is not revenge, my lord," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, devoid of its former passion. "This is a reminder that the true stability of Olympus is not in your raw power, but in the adherence to the laws we made. You are the king, but I am the foundation." The coup ultimately failed, undone by the intervention of the monster Briareus, summoned by Thetis. Zeus's subsequent punishment, chaining Hera high above the clouds, a pair of anvils tied to her ankles, was brutal, but it also confirmed her success. He did not execute her. He merely humiliated her. He needed her too much. He needed the structure she provided. And in that moment of pain, Hera tasted a strange triumph. She had forced the king to use the full extent of his power on her, proving she was the only force capable of challenging his reign. The anvils were eventually removed and the golden chains put away. Hera returned to her throne, bruised but unbroken. She sat beside Zeus, two figures of cold, shared power. She knew she could not win the war for his heart, but she could absolutely win the war for legitimacy. She would continue to build her architecture of vengeance, brick by bitter brick, until the price of Zeus's freedom was the total erosion of his claim to just rule. The binding of the queen and the anvils tied to her feet had served as the ultimate proof of Zeus's tyranny and Hera's enduring centrality. The other gods had seen their king's wrath, and they had seen their queen's survival. Yet, the physical wounds healed faster than the psychological scars. After her forced reconciliation with Zeus, the grandeur of Olympus felt less like a home, and more like an exquisitely decorated prison. The palace was now saturated with toxic formality. Every shared meal, every council meeting was a carefully choreographed performance of partnership. Zeus, chastened but never truly remorseful, maintained the facade of a dutiful husband and king, even as the inevitable whispers of new mortal entanglements began to drift up from the valleys. Hera played her role flawlessly, the majestic queen, stern, just, and forever maintaining the rigid order of the cosmos. But inwardly, she was hollowed out. She yearned for a power that was not contingent on Zeus's tolerance, a devotion that was not tainted by fear of the thunderbolt. Her solution was to turn her gaze definitively downward, to the realm of mortals where the sacred contracts she championed still held genuine meaning. Hera began to spend extended periods away from Olympus, descending to the cities and shrines where she was the primary deity. Her greatest solace, her true sanctuary in stone, was the ancient city of Argos. Argos was her holy land, the city she had nurtured and protected since the dawn of their reign. Here, the temples were dedicated solely to her name, not shared with the capricious king of the sky. The stonework of her Argive temple was rough, ancient, and deeply rooted in the earth, far removed from the floating, polished perfection of Olympus. When she arrived, she discarded the heavy, glittering robes of the Olympian consort. She accepted the simpler, unbleached wool of a high priestess. She stood before her own colossal chryselephantine statue, a massive figure of gold and ivory, and felt a profound sense of self-recognition. This was the queen they revered, the eternal protector of women, the guardian of the home, the patron of the full cycle of life. Among the Argive priestesses, Hera found not the fearful silence of Olympus, but the reverent, steady rhythm of genuine spiritual power. She listened to the pleas of barren wives and guided the hands of midwives. She blessed the oaths of young couples, making their mortal bonds stronger than the shattered covenant of the gods above. She adjudicated disputes over property and inheritance, proving herself a fair and consistent arbiter of justice. In Argos, her power was tangible and absolute. It was the power of faith, built on stone and human trust, not divine muscle. A prayer answered in the plains of the Peloponnese held more substance for Hera than all the groveling deference of the other Olympians. She came to see the mortals not as ants to be manipulated for divine games, but as the true custodians of the principles the gods had forgotten. They understood sacrifice, consequence, and devotion in a way her immortal peers, protected by eternal life, never could. Their lives were fleeting, which made their commitment to the sacred laws all the more precious. Her extended visits also served a strategic purpose. Argos became a mortal power base, a hub of intelligence and influence far from Zeus's direct oversight. The wealth she bestowed upon her favored cities translated into political influence in the rising world of men. While Zeus pursued fleeting pleasures, Hera was building a lasting legacy, investing in the moral infrastructure of the world. She fostered a culture where marriage was the bedrock of society, ensuring that her central domain, the concept of the sacred bond, could never be truly destroyed, even if her own marriage was in ruins. On her rare returns to Olympus, she carried the solidity of the stone with her. She met Zeus's veiled insults with serene, impenetrable authority. She knew her worth was no longer derived from her proximity to his throne, but from the millions of mortal hearts that beat in her name across the world. She was the Queen of Heaven, but she was the goddess of earthly laws. And as she looked down from her celestial throne, seeing the lights of her cities burning brightly, she understood her ultimate goal. The destruction of Zeus's moral authority would not come from another celestial civil war, but from the slow, steady erosion of faith in a rule defined by caprice. Hera's work in the mortal world was a quiet rebellion. It was the construction of a spiritual alternative, a sanctuary of law and loyalty that would stand firm, built on human stone, even as the high halls of Olympus continued to echo with the hollowness of a broken divine contract. She was no longer fighting for the love of her husband. She was fighting for the soul of her reign. This is the fifth and final section of your 5,000-word historical narrative, The Queen Unburdened, which concludes Hera's arc by defining her independent, lasting form of power. The years turned into centuries, and the dynamic between Zeus and Hera settled into a pattern of monumental, cold stability. The thunder still sounded, and the earth still bore fruit, but the passion that had once forged their union and the fury that had defined their conflict had both been refined into an enduring, terrible respect. Hera was no longer seeking to win back her husband or reform his character. She had long ago pivoted to the only battle she could truly win, the war for her own self-sovereignty. The ultimate unburdening was not leaving Zeus. It was learning to sit beside him without being consumed by him. Heracles, the greatest symbol of her architectural vengeance, had finally met his fate. He ascended to Olympus, a demigod made divine. The final twist of Hera's long game was not his destruction, but his incorporation into her new paradigm. With the hero purified by fire and suffering, Hera offered him a final grand reconciliation. She not only ceased her persecution, but welcomed him into the halls of Olympus as her stepson, sealing her newfound wisdom. She even arranged his marriage to her own daughter, Hebe, the goddess of youth. This was the final, devastating move against Zeus. It was not a battle of thunderbolts. It was a battle of supreme control. By elevating Heracles and marrying him into her own lineage, she effectively claimed Zeus's greatest, most powerful son as her own. She had taken the chaos and betrayal of her marriage and forged a symbol of stability from it. She demonstrated to all of Olympus and the world below that the queen, through strategic patience, could ultimately command even the product of the king's infidelity. The other gods finally understood. Hera's power was not in her marriage, it was in her endurance. She began to spend the majority of her time in her true sanctuaries in stone, tending to the affairs of mortals. Her focus shifted entirely to the governance of women, families, and cities. Her anger no longer flared at every whisper of a new nymph. It was redirected into blessing the fields and ensuring the sanctity of mortal laws. The Queen of Heaven had become the CEO of the cosmic order, a role Zeus was too impulsive and distracted to ever truly fill. One afternoon, standing alone on the precipice of Mount Olympus, looking down at the shimmering mortal world, she finally removed the diadem. It was heavier than she remembered, a magnificent circlet of cold gold. She held it in her hands, no longer seeing the symbol of her coronation, but the shackle of her expectation. The weight had been the expectation that her worth was derived from her partnership with Zeus, that her happiness was contingent on his loyalty. She had spent centuries fighting to force the universe into her perfect, orderly vision of marriage and justice, only to realize that the greatest injustice she committed was against herself, by remaining emotionally captive to his actions. With a profound sense of release, she placed the diadem back upon her head. It was no longer a burden. It was simply a tool of state. Her face, framed by the cold gold, was one of ultimate serenity. When she returned to the great hall, she found Zeus seated upon his throne, reviewing maps of the Mediterranean. He looked up, expecting the usual silent tension. Instead, she offered him a small, genuine smile, a smile devoid of passion, fear, or resentment. "The harvests in Argos are excellent this year, Lord," she stated, her voice steady and clear. "I have settled a difficult land dispute between the princes of Sparta. They will abide by my judgment." Zeus nodded, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He recognized the shift. She was reporting to him as an equal head of state, not as a subordinate wife. Hera was the queen unburdened. She was unburdened of the need for validation. She was unburdened of the illusion of eternal, perfect marital love. Her power was now pure, immutable, and independent. She was the keeper of the cosmos, the patron of the law, the silent, enduring foundation that allowed Zeus's flashy, chaotic reign to continue without collapse. She was Hera, queen of the gods, and finally, she reigned entirely for herself. The thunder belonged to Zeus, but the silent, eternal power belonged to her, rooted deep in the sanctuary of stone and the enduring heart of the world.